Coller back here, and we welcome in Arif Hasan from The Athletic. Arif, who you think's playing for the Vikings?
Uh, I'm gonna have to contact sources to find out who's on the roster.
Is it anyone? At the moment, it isn't. So let's talk about Everson Griffin for a minute here. He announces on Instagram that he's leaving, and Everson Griffin to me feels different. And you'll tell me if you didn't have this same feeling today when he announced that he wasn't coming back. And the reason is because he's still really good at football. Releasing someone like Xavier Rhodes or Linval Joseph, you can say, all right, well, those guys had fallen off. They're not worth what they're making anymore. But Joseph had 66 pressures last year and ranks in the top 15 for defensive ends. He still draws a lot of attention, and especially the first half of the year was outstanding. So to have him leave, that to me changes the dial from, yeah, reload to rebuild on the defensive side.
Yeah, I think so, and I think it's something the Vikings didn't anticipate. Otherwise, I don't think they would have committed themselves the way they did to Kirk Cousins. They're very clearly attempting to win now, but all they've really done, aside from signing Michael Pierce, is shed talent. It's pretty concerning, and Griffin, like you said, still has a couple of years, it seems like, left in him, especially if you put him in a rotational role, which I expect he'll be wherever he signs, so he'll have the ability to have like a maximum impact. The real concerning part is that the Vikings expected him to be back. I mean, they announced at the combine that they expect him to be back, which is a very rare thing to do, even if you do expect someone to be back, because you typically just don't say anything until all the pieces are in place. But I mean, they did it, and it's very clear. He's not coming back. He announced on Instagram. He reposted like something about interest with the Cowboys. It sounds like 5 or 6 other teams were interested. That's concerning.
Well, I think a lot of teams should be interested, and that is why it is concerning because you sort of felt like you had that money in the bank with Everson Griffin of knowing that if he came back on a reasonable deal, which is kind of what we expected in their tough salary cap days, that they would still have a really good defensive line. And you could still set up Danielle Hunter or Everson Griffin to be double teamed, but not both of them. And you can improve on the cornerback play from the outside corners and maybe work out something with Anthony Harris, and then still have a very, very good defense because Eric Kendricks is great and Harrison Smith is great. But this move is very much a swing toward, well, now who else should you be looking at moving? I mean, does this sort of move you more toward trading Anthony Harris or the thing that the internet really did not love being brought up, which was a Harrison Smith trade? Because now it feels like burn it all to the ground.
Yeah, and it's very awkward to say that in the context of a cap situation where Cousins is very likely going to either have to extend again in 2022 or take a $45 million hit for the team. I mean, I think that it's going to be difficult to rebuild if you don't give space for a quarterback to enter the team. But if you want a quarterback to enter the team, you need first round ammo to do it that requires trading Harris or somebody who has trade value like Harrison Smith. That's going to be pretty difficult. So, yeah, the Vikings might have to shift into rebuild mode because they haven't been able to retain any talent. But the way that they haven't been able to retain any talent has made it very difficult for them to rebuild. So they're in this very awkward period. They were already entering the offseason attempting to navigate this really tight situation, walking a tightrope. And they've basically just taken wrong steps every single step of the way, unless they were able to like recoup it on the back end. It doesn't look like they're able.
So disagree because I'm sorry, not Kai Forbath, but Dan Bailey is back and Britton Colquitt is back. So I don't know how you could look at it and say that they've lost a lot of talent when the best kicker in team history is back. Sorry, I didn't even effectively do the turbo snark there. I think it's a really interesting point about the Kirk Cousins extension because you do it out of desperation to make cap space for players to sign, and then your players leave anyway. And so now you're looking at a situation that normally a team, if they're in this spot, would not be signing a very, very expensive quarterback. I made the comparison earlier. It would have almost been like if the New York Jets had signed Kirk Cousins when he was initially a free agent. it never made much sense for the Jets to sign Kirk Cousins at that time because they just weren't ready to win. So why add a $30 million quarterback? And that's essentially, by signing him to a contract extension, what the Vikings have done here is added a very expensive quarterback to a team that needs that cap space and all the draft capital and so forth to build itself back up.
Yeah, and honestly, I was fine at the time with the Cousins extension, despite the fact that it put them in this really difficult, awkward situation 2 years from now, because I thought it signaled a move to be able to grab some sort of free agents that would be able to put the Vikings over the top. And then, of course, you trade away Stephon Diggs, that makes it a little bit more difficult. But hey, that frees up some cap space at the back end, and with the new CBA, you have the ability to sign a free agent and use the cap space at the back end, even if you don't free up that much in 2020. So hey, maybe there's something there, but they just haven't been. I mean, Michael Pierce is great, but he's a nose tackle, so there's like not really much that you've added to the team that substantially has improved their ability to win. But they very clearly signal that they want to do that now at the cost of future capability, which teams do all the time. Sometimes it works out. And the Vikings just haven't actually done the second part. They've like freed up all this room, and now they're just sitting there.
Yeah, in the Pierce signing for $27 million over 3 years, that also doesn't really fit. I mean, it fits with a team that was bringing back Everson Griffin and then maybe signing Nickel Roby-Coleman and drafting a first-round corner and hoping that Mike Hughes improves and keeping Anthony Harris. But if you trade Anthony Harris and Everson Griffin is gone, then signing an expensive nose tackle, I mean, that's the last piece you would want to add, as in, oh, we have a great defense. We just need this nose tackle, so let's overpay for him. Not, hey, let's start out our free agency period when we need to rebuild with something too expensive at that position. So I understand fully, and you wrote about this, I know, of like Mike Zimmer's thinking on why a nose tackle would be important. I'm not debating that part of it. I'm debating this position being one to invest a pretty good deal of money when you're up against the salary cap.
Yeah, and if he was 25 instead of 27, which I know sounds like a very small difference, but it really is pretty significant because, Linval Joseph was 25 when he initially started the Vikings in 2014. If he was 25 instead of 27, you could just say, hey, they're packing it away for the future, especially if it was a longer term deal than 3 years. But it might be that the Vikings really think they can hit on every single one of their draft picks if they trade Anthony Harris, let's say for a third round pick or a pick swap or something. They're basically betting that they can replace like 5 Pro Bowl talents with 5 or 6 picks in the top 105 picks, which seems pretty unlikely to me. I don't think any GM has done that, even if you include that incredible Saints draft class from a couple of years ago. I don't think they got 5 Pro Bowlers out of it. So there's not a way to improve the team in a really significant way, given the way that they're kind of moving these assets around. And I could be wrong. Maybe they're making a move for Jadeveon Clowney. There's already, some people creating a stir about that. And then you turn the whole ship around and you're like, oh, hey, great. They're ready to go. Let's go. But it just seems unlikely. So, hey, they could do some stuff on the back end that could make it pretty interesting. But right now, given what we know, it's really difficult to say that the team has found ways to execute what looked like their vision from the beginning of this offseason.
And you know, Arif, that I want nothing more than madness, than big trades, crazy moves, all-in type of plays, because that makes it fun to talk about for not only me, but everybody else who's a Vikings fan. But now the all-in type of moves that we talked about seem just like they wouldn't make sense all of a sudden, because not only is Griffin gone, that's a big deal, but Stephon Diggs being gone, also a big deal. And like you said, 22nd overall pick, are you getting a Pro Bowl wide receiver at that point? That's pretty hard to imagine right there. So if you said, they're going to trade some of this draft capital for Trent Williams and sign him to an extension that lowers his cap hit, and maybe they trade Riley Reif along with him, that you would almost go, for why? Right? Like, even though a week ago I would have said, oh, kind of makes sense because they're all in. But now it feels like if you make an all in move now, it almost seems like you just don't understand who you are.
Yeah, it really does, because the Vikings right now are essentially aiming for 8-8 or something like that. It's helping no one. And so, it doesn't make a ton of sense in terms of what their stated goals are. Like you said, if they make a couple more, they'd have to they'd have to keep re-upping it for it to end up making sense. They'd have to, use some of that draft capital to trade for Trent Williams, and they'd somehow have to magic a deal that would make, Jadeveon Clowney work. Which, if they're not going to sign Everson for like 10 million or however much he's asking for, they're not going to sign Jadeveon Clowney. So they'd have to be able to do that, and then they'd have to be able to figure out kind of what's happening at wide receiver. They'd have to sign Rashad Perriman and then trade up in the first round. But we've already used all these trade assets on Trent Williams. How are we going to do all this? So it's really difficult with the assets they have, with the moves they made, for them to be able to say, hey, no, we're fully committed to winning in 2020. Maybe that means we're going to take some hits on the back end. But it really seems like 2019 was their window based off of what they're doing right